nutrition, in my humble opinion, reverse mitochondrial function? I don't think so. The only way where we can improve mitochondrial function is through exercise. If mitochondria don't work, that cell and that organ is not going to function very well. Mitochondrial function and health is the next level.
How can one actually measure their mitochondrial health?
By measuring fat oxidation, fat burning, we can indirectly have a proxy for mitochondrial function.
Why is zone 2 training so important for our mitochondrial health?
Zone 2 improve the most two parameters, fat oxidation and lactate clearance capacity, which both are surrogates of mitochondrial function.
Introducing exercise physiologist Iñigo San Millán.
If you have higher blood lactate levels, it's a sign that your mitochondria are not processing that lactate or clearing it or recycling it properly.
A lot of people would just think that lactate is a waste product. You know, it's kind of, you go to the gym and your muscles hurt, and that's how people resonate with lactate.
Lactate, without a doubt, it's an amazing biomarker that has been there in front of our eyes. Lactate is the best fuel for the cells. And even in cancer, we know that it is a master regulator for carcinogenesis. So the way is about to combine it, as I said. If you do 4 days a week, zone 2 in combination with high intensity, at least 2 or so towards the end, that's when you start hitting some sweet spot.
Is there differences between men and women when it comes to zone 2?
Well, that's a good question. And I think things get mixed up because of...
If you are a regular listener to the show or Live Well Be Well, or this is your first episode you're listening to, I really want to ask just a very small quick favor. If you could please hit the subscribe button or leave a review, this helps the show more than you can imagine. It means the world to help growing this show, and you all know that I have a huge thing to want to hit 100,000 on YouTube this year, and I can't do that without your support. I really aim to bring you the best guests possible out there, and I pride myself in doing that for the show because it's so important. But to keep the guests coming, to get them to be bigger and to bring more helpful information to your ears and your eyes, I really would love to ask you to subscribe to the show. Thank you. I want to start with VO2 max because it's a big buzzword, especially in the last, I would say 3 to 5 years. It's become at the forefront of many health conversations. It's become the gold standard of fitness, the number one metric that every athlete wants to improve. But you've said that VO2 max really only scratches the surface. So why doesn't it tell us the full story?
We've been knowing about VO2 max for decades, and we've been using it for decades, especially with athletes. It dates back more than 100 years, at least, since we have more standard ways to measure it. And it's been always linked to fitness, to performance, therefore to health. And now in the times of longevity, right? It's one more parameter that is plugged in longevity, right? And it's a great measurement. However, it doesn't tell the whole story. There's more than that. VO2 max, it's a representative of the central cardiorespiratory adaptations, right? But there's more, because ultimately that oxygen is utilized by the cells, and is utilized by the cells in mitochondria, as well as fuels. And this is where the area of physiology in general has evolved from VO2 max to what happens at the cellular level. And in the same manner that we've been using, with athletes VO2 max for decades, right? And now it's mainstream. We have already passed that time. We work now at the cellular level, and this is what I see the mainstream, mainly in the area of longevity, getting into. In fact, already people are talking about mitochondrial function, metabolic health, right? And this is the next level. And this is what we've been working with athletes. For performance, you need to produce ATP, energy, and that's produced in mitochondria. And for health, if mitochondria don't work, that cell and that organ is not going to function very well because it doesn't produce ATP well enough. For longevity, as we age, our cells age, our mitochondria age, and our energy production overall ages as well and decreases. And that resides in mitochondria. Therefore, is the mitochondrial function and health is the next level.
Okay, so this is kind of like the next stage of where we're exploring now with, I would say, longevity is a buzzword, but mitochondrial health, I think many people will have known from GCSE biology and then forgotten about it. But the way that I always think about it is a powerhouse of the cells. But how can one actually measure their mitochondrial health? Because the VO2 max is, yes, a bit easier to attain and to get to, but mitochondrial health, how do we even measure that?
Well, we can do it through a muscle biopsy and
Okay.
get a chunk of muscle and look under the microscope or do a bunch of things to that. But I don't think it's a very convenient way to do, because you will have a chunk of like a big scar, and But
Yeah, that sounds quite painful.
yeah, I don't think you want that. But the other way, I developed a methodology years ago, and I've been using it with athletes for a long time, where we have two proxies for that. On one hand, with the same device that you measure VO2 max, which it's like in a colloquial form, we call them metabolic cards. They've been always use metabolic cards. We can look at gas exchange, right? And so when we look at gas exchange, we look indirectly through some complicated equations. We can see how much fat and carbohydrates you're burning in grams per minute. We can see that. Now, when it comes to fat, we know that fat can only be burned in mitochondria. Okay, so by looking at fat, by measuring fat oxidation, is called fat burning, we can indirectly have a proxy for mitochondrial function. Then lactate can only be burned in mitochondria, right? So by pricking your finger or your earlobe and getting a small sample of lactate and measuring it, we can have an idea of how well your cells are processing glucose, and which under resting conditions, it happens in mitochondria. But the fact is that if you have higher blood lactate levels, it's a sign that your mitochondria are not processing that lactate or clearing it or recycling it properly. Therefore, with the two parameters, fat utilization and lactate, you can indirectly see or measure mitochondrial function. We published that study a few years ago, and now we have already published a preprint about an extension of that study where we look at muscle biopsies. And in the muscle biopsies, we look directly how they work, and we correlate them with this methodology. So it's quite robust to do it in a non-invasive way and an ambulatory manner where a lot of people can do it out there.
Wow, that's fascinating. So I think a lot of people would just think that lactate is a waste product. It's kind of, you go to the gym and your muscles hurt, and that's how people resonate with lactate. But you're saying now we can use that as a measure to test how well our mitochondria are functioning. Is that ready available? Can people go and access that quite easily, or is it still quite hard to get our hands on?
Yeah, so to look at your VO2 max, you have to go usually to an exercise physiology laboratory at your local university, if they have one, or your local hospital. More hospitals have those devices then. And that's, as I mentioned, that's the same machine or device that measures fat oxidation as well. But lactate, you can do it with the handheld device. Now they're very common. It's kind of the glucose meters, but they measure lactate. You can even do it yourself with a little bit of technique. But the combination of both is very accurate. But even only one alone, like in this case, lactate, a lot more people can do it without going to a hospital or a university.
Wow. Okay. So we should be maybe looking more at our lactate levels than we have been previously.
Yes, lactate, without a doubt, it's an amazing biomarker that has been there in front of our eyes. It's lactate. It's everywhere in the body, and what we know very well from the pioneer studies from over 50 years ago, from Dr. George Brooks from the University of California, Berkeley, who's my mentor and my great friend and a colleague. He has been discovering everything we know pretty much about lactate. He was swimming upstream for decades, trying to prove that lactate was not first a waste product as a result of anaerobic metabolism, and second, that lactate is the best fuel for the cells. And then the lactate is a signaling hormone that is needed for the homeostasis of many cells in the body. And yeah, he has been proving all these concepts throughout the years, which have been transformational to understand cellular metabolism, whether for exercise or for other diseases. And now we've been taking that lactate a little bit farther. And even in cancer, we know that it is a master regulator for carcinogenesis, some idea that we proposed in 2017 through our what we call our lactagenesis hypothesis, that it was rejected 7 or 8 times and finally got on because it was a crazy concept, and even 2 editors wrote us back saying, you guys are crazy. Yeah, you know what you're doing. And now, and I mean, we're talking about 7, 8 years later now, our article has about 850 citations in the literature. So people have been paying attention, entering that door. And now, I mean, without a doubt, lactate is a major component in cancer. And it's going to become just a bigger one. But it has a complicated role in the body, and it's a great fuel. If you give a cell lactate or glucose or ketones or fat, it's going to prefer lactate. Is the preferred fuel for the cells, and because it's the fastest one to be burned, and it's the signaling molecule. It's very important, as I said, for homeostasis, for the good and for the bad. Because if it builds up in the cells and you don't have enough clearing capacity, it can become pathological. But and it's a great aid and assistant to exercise. People think that the buildup of lactic acid, which doesn't exist in the first place, the body produces lactate, but lactate it's necessary for the continuation of energy processes in the cell, and in fact, it removes one proton that causes acidosis. So what happens in our muscles is that as we increase exercise intensity, that burning sensation that we feel, that's not from lactate. It's from the production of ATP and what we call the ATP hydrolysis, which is the burning of ATP for producing energy. And that's what liberates a lot of acid particles called protons, and they make the muscle very acidic. And that's the acidosis that decreases the contraction, and it feels that burning sensation. Lactate, it helps by removing a proton. So it's a removing protons. It's instead of adding. But it's a concept that it's been taking decades to explain, and hopefully now that it's a little bit more mainstream, we can get to understand it better.
Wow. So when you just said it there about the mitochondria runs better on lactate, how do we then produce more lactate? Is it just exercise, or is there other forms of how we can be making sure that we're feeding our cells to what you're telling us?
Well, it's not that mitochondria run better on lactate. Lactate is it's burnt in mitochondria, right?
Okay.
So if you don't have a good mitochondrial function, you're not going to be burning lactate very well. Furthermore, lactate is the mandatory end product of glucose utilization. So when you burn glucose, you always produce lactate. Always. The higher the glucose burning, right, the more lactate you produce. So it gets to a point that lactate, if you want to burn it inside mitochondria during exercise or even at rest, first has to go glucose, the first door that is at the entrance of the cell. Okay, then that glucose is transformed in a substance called pyruvate, which ultimately has to enter the furnace of the cell to be burned and produce ATP or energy, right? But that furnace has another door, right? And that is the one that it has to be also working. And if the flux of glucose is too much into the cell, whether because there's very high intensity or there's a pathological state, glucose cannot be burned. That pyruvate cannot enter that door into mitochondria, into the furnace, and be burned. And the only way they have is to be transformed to lactate, right? So when you see, and that lactate escapes to the blood. So when you see high blood lactate levels, it's telling you that glucose is not be fully oxidized or burnt, right, in mitochondria, and is being transformed to lactate, because otherwise you would see very low blood lactate levels, meaning that the glucose is very well oxidized or burnt.
Got you. Okay. So if people really want to make sure that, how can people, apart from taking a lactate test, is there any physical signs that one person will know if they're having good mitochondrial health before they get to testing their lactate levels?
I think that this is one of the areas where we don't have biomarkers. Let's say people have type 2 diabetes, for example, right? It's a metabolic disease characterized by a poor capacity to burn glucose, but not just to transport it through the cell, but to burn it. And in resting conditions, you burn it in mitochondria, right? Now, the biomarker that we have is a diagnosis. We have the glucose tolerance test or the hemoglobin A1C, right? That's a diagnosis, right? There are no other biomarkers, unfortunately. Same thing for Alzheimer's. Alzheimer's, we know that beyond the amyloid plaque hypothesis, we know that no drug has been able to target that plaque, and that now the new thinking in Alzheimer's is looking at brain metabolism, right? And that Alzheimer patients or Alzheimer's disease is characterized by two hallmarks: insulin resistance and mitochondrial dysfunction, which are the same two hallmarks of type 2 diabetes, which is now given the name, or rename it, more colloquially, type 3 diabetes or brain diabetes or end-stage type 2 diabetes, right? But without a doubt, there's a big part of its pathology is a mitochondrial dysfunction and insulin resistance. So there's a poor glucose utilization. But again, we don't have any biomarker, right? The biomarker that we have is the PET scan that has been in front of us forever, right? You look at the PET scan of a typical Alzheimer's, and most of us have either seen one or looked at the internet how they look like. We see the very bright images, right? The very bright orange or red and yellow, especially the orange or red. That's metabolic activity, right, of the brain. And that specifically, it is a glucose activity in the brain. That's a normal brain. A brain with early Alzheimer's has reduced activity, reduced metabolic activity, and is reduced glucose activity. An advanced Alzheimer's disease, you can see the image that is very dark, is very blue, right? There's not much metabolic activity because there's not much glucose utilization. But again, that's not a biomarker, it's a diagnosis. And this is what one of the areas that we need to focus is on developing novel biomarkers so that we can see metabolic or cellular dysregulations at the mitochondrial level a decade or even two before it becomes a full disease, because then we can intervene, whether it's with lifestyle interventions, exercise, nutrition, or we can intervene therapeutically through targeted therapies, novel targeted therapies.
As someone who has spent a long time studying the mind-body connection, I am constantly asked, what do I use to track my health? Since April, you've probably seen, if you're watching the show, me wearing a piece of tech on my arm, and that is No Watch, because I genuinely believe it has been one of the most thoughtful and mind-aware pieces of tech that you can wear. Unlike most wearables that focus just on your steps or your sleep, No Watch is a bit different. It gives you real-time insights into your nervous system, the invisible engine that calibrates everything from your stress to your sleep to your recovery, your rest, and ultimately your health. With its stress recovery metric, it doesn't just show you how long you were stressed for, but also how long you recovered. It shows you your homeostasis. And that to me is where real health begins. And I think it's all something that we're craving. And most importantly, it does this without dragging you back to your phone, because that motion just depletes you. It delivers meaningful health insights to you only when something genuinely matters, using AI to turn complex signals into clarity that you can understand. And in just 5 days, it calibrates to your body and creates your personalized health fingerprint. You can try it for 30 days completely free. And if you're curious, now's the time because they're giving you guys 15% off with my code LWBW15 if you head to nowatch.com. And you guys know, as listeners of Live Well Be Well and this whole community, that understanding yourself in the most mindful way is one of the most powerful things that you can do for your health. And this little gadget helps you on your journey. Well, it's so interesting that you mentioned about Alzheimer's there, because in the UK, dementia is the number one killer. And it's interesting that I've spoken to Chris Palmer on this show about metabolic health and mental health. And the mitochondria is always at the center of these conversations so much. But I think so many of us are confused about how we can improve our mitochondrial health. So we started at the beginning about talking about VO₂ max as looking as one predictor. But you talk so much and you've pioneered this whole sector with exercise to help support mitochondrial function. So although we're in a bit of an explosive of chronic disease right now, there is a lot of things that we can do. We've got to have hope to get our mitochondrial health like pumping back. So you have pioneered, and I know that you know there's a lot more to it, but you have pioneered Zone 2 training. So I thought it's important to start there. Why is Zone 2 training so important for our mitochondrial health?
Well, I mean, everything starts with professional athletes. They have taught us a lot, right? I always say we cannot understand imperfection if we don't understand perfection in the first place. Those are the Formula One cars, right? Those are the gold standard of what a human should be, right? Metabolically speaking, right? And this is why I've been fortunate for almost 30 years to be able to work with these kind of humans and be able to understand them very well. So they have taught us a lot in order to understand other concepts in different pathologies characterized by dysfunctions at the metabolic cellular level, right? So performance on one hand, right? It's about, as I mentioned, about producing ATP fast, producing energy fast and lasting as long as you can. Competition is that, being as fast as you can for as long as you can, right? That's whether we're talking about swimming or rowing or cycling or football, basketball, you need to be fast and you need to sustain that effort, right? So for that, you need to produce ATP at very high levels and have a very metabolically efficient engine, right? Which is what happens at the cell. And that furnace, that powerhouse, that central part of that engine, the cell, is mitochondria. Right? So what do we need to do with athletes? Improve their mitochondrial function. So for that, back in the days, I developed these methodologies to try to understand how we can translate what we were learning about cellular metabolism into training. So we know that different exercise intensities elicit different metabolic results. It's not the same result when you go for an easy spin on the bike, for example, than if you do a 30-second sprint. You're mobilizing different energy systems, right? So that's what I saw in the laboratory with these methodologies, with the metabolic cart, with the lactate. And I started to define different training zones because there were different metabolic events. If you do a maximal, an incremental exercise intensity, you see this beautifully. And anybody who has done this test or perform this test as an operator, you can see these events happening in front of your eyes, right? And therefore, we're talking about from very low intensity all the way to maximal sprinting, right? So if you put together the dots, you're going to see these metabolic events. That being said, that's why I created different training zones, because I couldn't tell an athlete, hey, you're in a high glycolytic intensity, or you're in 100% oxidative phosphorylation state. That's why you have to train, right? You cannot speak that language, right? So I had to do something that was very easy to understand. And that's what I decided, zone 1 through zone 6, right? Then I started by trial and error. Okay, now let's try the next step. Okay, what is the intensity that elicits the best effect, not just for mitochondria, but for other intensities, right? Because we always have to remember that when it comes to athletic performance, you always win competitions at the high intensities. I have never heard about any athlete or seen any athlete winning a competition in the zone 2 or low intensities. Never happens. So, but unfortunately, people are taking to the extremes now, and all of a sudden, high intensity is gone, it's worthless. Well, it depends. If you're an athlete, you must train high intensity. And my athletes train very high intensities. In fact, about 50% of all the best times, the PRs, happen during training, not competition, right? So it's very high intensity because you need to stimulate that. So anyways, that's why you set up all these training zones. And that's what I started to see people in their responses back in the laboratory, where you can study that metabolic response very closely and see which trainings have improved the most. So what I saw is that zone 2, that was the one that improved the most. 2 parameters that I mentioned earlier: fat oxidation and lactate clearance capacity, which both are surrogates of mitochondrial function. I was seeing these over 25 years ago. And then obviously working with athletes, you saw that also in the competition. That's where you saw the action, right? And so that's why the zone 2 came along. But of course, you have higher intensities, zone 4, zone 5, which are, that turbo. You need to improve that turbo, right? The important thing is that you also have to train the turbo, which are like the high intensities, the zone 5, zone 4, because you need to stimulate that turbo, because that's where you're going to improve the competition as well. But then you need to stimulate also the sprint, because sometimes you need to sprint, But anyways, well, when it comes to mitochondrial function, that's important. But when it comes to VO2, right, which is the cardiorespiratory adaptations, training high intensity is very efficient. That's probably more efficient, if not more efficient, than training at zone 2. But as I said from the beginning, that's how you express your cardiorespiratory adaptations to exercise. Right. But another thing is like how well mitochondrial function works. So anyway, so this is what now from the lessons that we have learned from elite athletes, then I started working with people from different pathologies, right? And chronic diseases, including type 2 diabetes, cardiac rehab patients, oncology patients, and metabolic syndrome. And that's what I saw in these people also improved mitochondrial function the most. That training. And
Zone
also
2 training.
people, yes,
The
that's
zone
what
2.
I was seeing. And also with people who just wanted to get fitter. Typical person who has been struggling forever because they only did HIIT, for example. And at first they see results, but eventually they get injured or they get discouraged or they lose patience with that because it's not sustainable for many people, not for all, of course. So I'm not saying that you have to disregard high intensity at all, but I think that you need to reduce the amount. And this is what we know very well, again, from the lessons we learn from athletes, that you cannot sustain high intensity training all the time. And we don't see that. I mean, when any of us who has been working with athletes at a high level can confirm this. You don't see let's say, like very high intensity sport, like swimming, right? It's under a minute. Okay. It's under a minute. Okay. What do I have to do to training? What's your intuition tells you? Let's just do 40, 50-second sprints all day, right? Okay. We can't be so naive to think that the best coaches in the world and the best swimmers have thought about this, right? Of course they have. Does it work? Well, just go around any swimming pool around the world with the best swimmers in the world. They spend hours a day, 2, 3, 4 hours a day, swimming up and down, up and down. And of course they do intervals, but it's not sustainable. And you can take this to any sport out there, right? So the same thing, for regular life. High intensity is important, but it's not sustainable. And the zone 2, the characteristic that it has had is that it works and it's sustainable.
So when we think about zone 2, and tell me if I'm wrong, but I always think about zone 2 in training, that I can just about talk, but not in a comfortable way. How can someone understand, if they don't have a wearable, how can they understand where zone 2 is?
Yeah, that's a good question. And this is about it. And it resembles closely to what we see in the laboratory when we establish the parameters for that zone 2 and the rest of the zones, right? Yes, that's an intensity where definitely. We cannot keep this conversation. This would be arresting as we are, but it's a conversation that you can sustain. I mean, you can sustain, but it takes an effort, right? It's a forced conversation that you have to breathe, you have to talk, but you can't sustain it with an effort. If you cannot sustain that conversation for more than a few seconds, right, that you're already in very high intensity. And this is due to glycolysis, which is another event that you see very well in the laboratory. When you're working in zone 2, you're burning glucose, but you're burning fat. And that's the intensity of the one you burn the most fat, which is another concept now getting very popular, which is the fat max, right? That's the intensity of the one you burn the most fat. I've been using that concept for 25 years at least, and using for weight loss purposes too. People would come to the laboratory and because they've been trying to lose weight through exercise and they can't. And then when you do the test, you see that they've been exercising at too high intensities where you burn zero fat. And you show that to them because in the laboratory, you see very well where you burn the fat. You see the grams per minute, the fat oxidation in grams per minute and carbohydrate oxidation. So that gets to a point that you get to your fat max. And then as exercise intensity increases, the fat disappears and you burn zero fat. And why is that? It's because as you go on to a higher exercise intensities, the cells, the muscles need faster ATP, faster energy. And that energy cannot be supplied by fat anymore. Because while fat can give you more overall energy, it's slower. It's like a diesel gasoline, right? It's lower way. It takes more time to give you that energy, which when you're at lower intensity is great, right? This is part of the evolution, right, of humans, because we can only store about half a kilo, 500 grams, like 2 pounds of glycogen. No, 1 pound of glycogen, sorry, which is how we store glucose, carbohydrates, right? So the body tends to preserve that tank very well. And for that, starts using other fuels, mainly fat, right? But when exercise intensity is very high, fat cannot give you energy fast enough. And you need to switch to carbohydrates. And then, and sorry, I've been going the wrong way. This is what happens is like you suppress fat. And this is why a lot of people were not burning fat because they were always in carbohydrate burning. They were not burning adipose tissue. But then through the talk test, to your point, the fact that you're speaking fast is because you're burning a lot of carbohydrates. You're producing a lot of lactate and you start buffering that lactate. And that CO2, that's part of buffering the lactate. And that forces you to breathe faster, right? So when you're breathing faster, you're at a higher metabolic stress, and you start decreasing significantly the amount of fat burning. So when you can't stop at all, when you can't speak at all, you're not burning fat, you're burning glucose.
Wow. Okay. So sometimes people might just be doing too much high intensity and that's why they're not losing any weight.
Yes, we've been knowing that for decades as well in working with athletes.
But I don't think that's a normal conception in the public. I think a lot of people today will go to the gym to want to sweat and burn a lot of energy and wonder why they're not losing weight. And this is the exact reason why. So you're saying if they can balance that with more zone 2 and recovery, their mitochondrial health will improve.
Yes, it pays off. People would say, of course, yeah, but if you do high intensity, you increase your basal metabolic rate and you burn fat down the road in the next 6, 12, 24 hours. Sure, of course, you can do that, of course. But why not burning fat while you're exercising? So instead of burning fat after you exercise, relying on what you think that you're going to be burning at rest because of the high intensity you did, right? I think there's room for both concepts, obviously, yeah. But again, why not burning fat during exercise? Because you're going to burn more fat during exercise. You burn it depends, right? But it depends on your fitness level and your mitochondrial function level. You burn between 0.2, 0.3 to 0.8 or 9, close to 1 gram per minute, right, of fat. That doesn't seem quite much, but day after day after day after day, it counts, right? But during rest, you burn very little fat, right? So you might be burning 0.1, 0.15. So why not burning 0.4, 0.5 grams, half a gram for doing exercise for 60 minutes or 90 minutes, right? And just you get a calculation. People can get a calculator. Just plug some numbers in, and you're going to see that if you have about 4 days a week, about 4 to 5 hours a week, burning fat, 0.4, 0.5, every month you're going to be losing. It depends on the time, and your fat burning, but you can be losing 1 kilo if you want to lose weight, right? So along with the diet, it can really help, But anyways, that fat max coincides also with zone 2. That's a good parameter to see.
Wow. Okay. So I find this really interesting as well from a nutritional perspective, because there's also the argument that if you're training at high intensity all the time, you're also going to be eating a lot more as well. So if you are on a fat loss mission and you're consuming more calories and you're having more of a nutrition load, that also is also quite a hard one for losing weight as well. So and I'm not saying that's right or wrong, but there's also eating more when exercising more. And I do see that a lot within clinic where people are just exhausted and they're kind of eating their way through the day because they're doing so much HIIT training.
Yes. We have to also think that, if you do high intensity training, you're going to burn a lot of energy and you're going to have to resynthesize it, right? And that's important to know that you're going to be burning a lot of energy and you're going to have to eat a lot more to resynthesize it. And this is the problem sometimes. It's like, how much you have to eat. Some people, they think they have to eat more than what they need. Some people, they think they have to eat less, right? Then when you have low, imagine that you have low glycogen content because you're having a low carbohydrate diet and you can only store about half a kilo, 1 pound. Then people with high intensity training, you can be burning somewhere between 4, 5, 7 grams per minute of carbohydrates, right? So you can run out of glycogen pretty fast, especially over a few days. And then the body tries to defend that. The body does not like to lose glycogen, right? So it starts adapting to that. The first line of adaptation from an evolutionary standpoint is muscle breakdown. That happens in athletes. We know that happens very well. That happens in ICU patients, and then happens at cancer patients. So the more glucose you use, and once you hit depleted glycogen storages, the body is very wise because it can break down different proteins in the muscle, converting different amino acids in the muscles, like the branched chain amino acids. They can become glucose. They can go to the liver and become glucose. And also glutamine, it goes directly into mitochondria. But you pay a price because those amino acids are derived from muscles. So the muscle starts eating itself to feed itself. It's like an oxymoron in a way, right? But it's an evolutionary mechanism. Then you move on to the next phase, which is start using ketones, right? Which is much longer adaptation time, right? But right away, many people is what happens. They are burning all glucose when they go out. They don't have enough glycogen. They're starting breaking down protein. They don't lose weight. They get tired, fatigued, and also you increase the chances of getting injured. And so I am not saying that HIIT is bad, but if you do HIIT, you need to be very, very well monitored, right? Otherwise, it can be tricky. So when we do HIIT training with athletes, we need to monitor very well because they can get overtrained like that, and that's why the events in a week where an athlete does high intensity training are very limited because of you can get overtrained.
So with like a normal person listening to this, and I say normal because, you do work with elite athletes, like people from Tour de France, and stuff that you've done with them is incredible. But obviously the normal average person doesn't have the time that an athlete has or the expense. So I think the general conversation online, which I was trying to find for this conversation, is that most people are saying 4 to 5 times a week of exercise. How much zone 2 should that be for an average person? If they're going to the gym 4 or 5 times a week, how should they be looking at their exercise to support mitochondrial health? And what would you suggest?
An ideal dose should be somewhere around 200 to 300 minutes a week, right? That's somewhere around 3 to 4 hours a week of zone 2. It works really well. And if on top of that, maybe towards a zone 2 session, you do high intensity, at least 2 days a week, that's important. So you can do, let's say, ideally, you do 1 hour to an hour and a half at zone 2 on the bike, for example, or 1 hour on the rowing machine, or you do 40 minutes to an hour running or fast walking, right? If you do that 4 days a week, 2 days a week, you can do high intensity, right, towards your VO2 max, right, to stimulate VO2 max also, and to stimulate what we call the turbo that I was mentioning, the glycolytic adaptations, right? But you just have to touch it, right? If you can, can you, or if you enjoy it, can you do a sprint, or can you do 2 minutes maximum exercise? If you're a cardiac patient, you're not going to be able to probably do it. If you're an oncology patient, you're not going to be able to do it, right? If you're a longevity person, you might not have the stamina yet, or you might not enjoy it, or you might enjoy it very well, right? But I think it's important to try to stimulate that high intensity twice a week.
Yeah.
And then resistance training, obviously. Yes, and then resistance training 2 or 3 days a week. The research shows that if you do like a well-rounded strength training program, about 2 days a week is enough, or should be enough at least to maintain muscle health, not to become a bodybuilder, to have a lot of muscle, right? But to maintain your muscle mass, 2 days a week should be important.
I'm interrupting for one moment to ask one small favor. Please subscribe to the show. This helps it grow more than you know. And I'm so bad at asking this from you. I'm so bad at thinking about this. But my goal is 100,000 to get to on YouTube. And I really want to bring you more content and better guests and bigger episodes. And we can only do that with your help together. So please do hit subscribe. Thank you. And so it's interesting because I've had Dr. Stacey Sims on this show, who talks a lot about women's health, and talks a lot about zone 2 training as well. And it's really interesting because obviously you've been speaking about zone 2 for such a long time. Is there differences between men and women when it comes to zone 2? Are a lot of these studies mostly based on men? What does the women's health sector show? Do we need to be doing less or more of zone 2 training? I think Stacey's argued on the show that she agrees with zone 2, but maybe we need to be doing a bit less of it as women, but she's still a massive advocate for it. But she says it's in its infancy. Now I have you on, what is your view on women versus men in zone 2 training? Is there any evidence that you can share with us, or even that you've worked with athletes yourself in this sector?
Well, that's a good question. And I think that things get mixed up because of the perception that everything is zone 2, and therefore whether you're a man or a woman, that's not it. You need to do high intensity. And this is when I started with the concept of zone 2, I was the zone 4 and the zone 5 also. And as I mentioned, I had never heard anybody winning a race in zone 2. For you need to do a high intensity. Now everything comes to the extreme, right? That is only zone 2, and that's not true. So maybe when Stacey refers that you need to do less zone 2 is because you need to do more high intensity. I agree with that because that's what I recommend to my patients, whether they are men or women, or my athletes also. So that's the important thing, that you need to have, and as we just talked, we need to do some 1 or 2 times a week. You need to get those incursions into high intensity because are necessary for that glycolytic capacity. The one thing too, women have a decreased glycolytic capacity, and by glycolytic capacity I mean that turbo capacity, and that's the high intensity. They have a lower muscle mass, they have a lower capacity for those fast twitch muscles to produce ATP fast, right? And therefore, there's a reason for women, they can try to stimulate that more. That being said, when it comes to mitochondrial function, men and women are equal or should be equal, right? And therefore, any exercise that increases, mitochondrial function should be applied, like zone 2.
It sounds very similar. So I guess you're saying that men and women shouldn't have this really any differently. We should both be prioritizing zone 2. Yet actually women will struggle more with HIIT because of these muscle fibers to produce the ATP. And that makes so much sense because I went through a phase probably about 8 years ago when HIIT was, I don't know if you remember, there was a huge surge in HIIT and every studio was opening and everyone was doing HIIT. And I felt worse than I've ever felt before, like awful. And also what was coming up at that time, and I'd be really interested to ask you about this with exercise and also how you train athletes and if it's different for men and women. I was also fasting before I was doing those sessions as well. So you can imagine I had like no energy in me and I was going off to do these ridiculously expensive classes for an hour and raising into zone 4, zone 5. And I've never felt worse in my life.
Yeah, you're totally right. And this is one of the things that, HIIT was a hype, and it was very popular 10 years ago. But very few people from 10 years ago, they're still doing it, or not that many people, because or at least people who were pursuing health benefits through HIIT. It's not sustainable, and it can lead to injuries. Again, I am not saying that HIIT is bad for you, but any exercise program based on HIIT, right, is not sustainable. There are no athletes in the world who all the training they do is HIIT. It doesn't exist. And believe me, I know a little bit about what athletes train, but it doesn't exist. And in fact, now, and I'm not saying if it's a tendency or not, but what we have seen historically is the 80-20, whereas the proportions of the time, or not the time, the sessions, not the time, because the sessions that you dedicate to different intensities, about 80% is lower intensity, call it zone 2 maybe, and about 20% is higher intensity. This is the approach that we've been using with athletes forever, and it has worked. Any other approach of doing 20-80, like 20% lower intensity and 80% HIIT, it doesn't tend to work. It causes overtraining, fatigue, and I was mentioning earlier. But that's kind of what we do with athletes. So the whole thing of now the 80-20, it comes from again, like as many concepts come from what we have learned with athletes, they're now becoming mainstream, right? But that 80-20 is not about minutes or percentage of minutes, because in fact, if we go by the minutes, it's even less. If you look at the volume, just observationally, if you look at the volume of any athlete, whether it's a very high intensity of athlete, like a swimmer, 100-meter swimmer, or a rower, or a marathon runner, about 5 to 10% of the entire minutes per season are in high intensity, right? So, but we need to think more about sessions. So it's about 80% of the sessions to contemplate maybe zone 2, and about 20% of the sessions should contemplate high intensity. And the way we break it down is so many times we isolate a session because they have more time to specifically do high intensity because of the demands of competition. Other sessions specifically is zone 2 training, and they can be 4 or 5 hours, but mere mortals don't have 4 or 5 hours, or they even can do 4 or 5 hours at zone 2 or high intensity. So the way is about to combine it, as I said, but if you do 4 days a week, zone 2 in combination with high intensity, at least 2 or so towards the end, that's when you start hitting some sweet spot. And then that was like the distribution, right? It's more like 80-20. But again, like hit, it's something that, it's just a lot of people, did it, but it's many people didn't enjoy it.
Have you had to change a lot of these athletes' mindsets on this approach to more an 80% like lower intensity and the 20% high intensity? Like, have you seen them have some resistance to that? Because obviously you've seen insane changes. I'd love for you to share some of these stories for our listeners, but how is the mindset approach when you're working with athletes in this sector?
Not much, to be honest, because that's been the mentality always like that. In fact, for as I mentioned earlier, right? If you watch what swimmers do and have done forever, and they continue breaking records, is that you go to a swimming and you see the world-class swimmers, they swim up and down, up and down. And then eventually, obviously, they do some intensities, right? But it's not the other way around. So you don't have to convince them to, hey, you can't do 1,000 sprints a day. It's bad for you. Do 5 or do 10, right? Well, they're already there, right? In fact, what I had to convince them more is that zone 2 is a much harder intensity than just cruising, which was what a lot of people were doing. Because that 80-20, they didn't know it by 80-20, but that's what they were doing, was like more aerobic training, long endurance, run or ride. It was too easy, right? And it was too easy. It was close to a recovery intensity, and that doesn't stimulate that bioenergetics of mitochondrial function as much. So it was about convincing them that they had to go faster. And if you look at, if you talk to some other people that I've been working with at Zone 2, especially at high level athletes, it's really, really, really demanding, very demanding, and until they get used to that. But it's not an easy training at all. For that, we have recovery days.
Okay, and what does those recovery days look like? Nothing?
No, I'm not active recovery. I mean, you have to do nothing. It's important to. That's what I think. I remember when I introduced also the concepts of off days, like a long time ago, to the athletes I was working with, it was a crazy idea to have an off day or even a recovery week, like an active recovery, right? But now everybody does an off day completely, and at least an active recovery day, which is, like a light run with friends to grab a coffee, right? Or a light bike ride, to grab another coffee with friends and come back. It's something that is more, to me, there's no difference between an active recovery day than just do nothing, right? Because when you do nothing, you just rest. And we do active recovery days, maybe more psychological, because to break out of the routine of training hard, because you need to train by yourself many times in individual sports. So that day where you're going to have fun and just gather with some friends, that's your recovery day for a coffee ride, for example, or a coffee run. But you need those too.
To make sure you're performing, but also to make sure, I guess, your immune system and everything, you need recovery for so many different dimensions. Your immune system plays such a big role in exercise.
Yeah, and this is something that to me it's an area of importance, because I have seen a lot of people. Let's not talk about athletes now, but obviously you see that overtraining, but you see a lot of people, they're whether it's for longevity or for fitness, they are completely crushed and they don't know it. People who have, as you were saying, on top of doing one routine of exercise, they're going through extreme diet, they're struggling through, and that has consequences. You can pay for those. And that has consequences in the long term. For example, and I've seen, looking at biomarkers, I do a lot of biomarkers to look at how athletes are assimilating training and competition. But again, we can use these biomarkers for people, for longevity purposes, people with different diseases, and how they're assimilating that dose of training. Is it too much or is the right one, right? So I see biomarkers, and we see a lot of muscle damage, for example, in people, and low-grade inflammation, chronic low-grade inflammation. When you have muscle damage, or when you are working so hard and not enough nutrients and not enough rest, the body fights it, because it's an aggression to the body. It's an insult. The body cannot recover fast enough, and therefore it starts breaking down like muscle mass. And one of the ways that the body has to heal is inflammation. It's a physiological process, but that inflammation usually should be acute according to the damage. When that damage is chronic, that inflammation becomes chronic. And that's what you start seeing also, some biomarkers of telling you that that person has chronic low-grade inflammation, which, as we know from epidemiological studies, it's important because it's been related to multiple diseases.
Yeah, I mean, inflammation is the start of every chronic disease, right? And I think like when we don't sometimes always are aware of how much pressure our immune system is under, but it's not just exercise, it's all the other things in the day. Like I know if I'm doing an intense session and then I've got an intense work day and I've not slept well and then my nutrition's not great, I'm not going to get the outcome of that session that I want, which is really important to think about. And I mean, I want to make sure that we touch on metabolic flexibility because this might also be connected to this as well. You were saying just earlier before this that it's quite a new term. Can you explain metabolic flexibility? Because my understanding is how easily you can switch from fats to carbohydrates, which I feel like women do pretty well in their menstrual cycle phases. But can you talk to us a little bit about this term and get us to understand it better?
Yeah, so metabolic flexibility is not a new term necessarily, but we've been knowing for maybe 20, 25 years. But yeah, now it's mainstream, like a lot of things. And but yeah, it's about that, right? I mean, in a simple way, it's about the ability, to switch back and forth between fuels, mainly fats and carbohydrates. Absolutely. And where does it happen? Where do you burn fuels? In mitochondria, right? You burn the fuels because you have to produce ATP. And that ATP happens in mitochondria, and when you burn those fuels are in mitochondria. And yes, this is why metabolic flexibility and mitochondrial function are pretty much identical terms, at least in my view, right? Because if you have a good mitochondrial function, like athletes, you're going to be switching back and forth fuels very well. You want to burn fat now? Okay, let's burn fat. You want to burn high amounts of glucose? Okay, let's do that. That's being metabolically flexible, right? And that's pretty much what is the same terms. Metabolic flexibility and mitochondrial function are, for these purposes of bioenergetics, are very important. And when mitochondrial dysfunction happens or mitochondrial decay happens, the first thing that you start seeing is a decrease in the capacity to burn those fuels, right? And that's you start become inflexible. And we can talk about that in more detail. That's the study that exactly what we were talking about the other day about that transporter that we have identified. It's the root or one of the roots of the issues.
This is the gut floor, right? The transporter that we were talking about in the study.
Yes.
Yeah. So you just mentioned there, which we should definitely go to study, but you just mentioned there before that mitochondrial decay. Sounds obviously cellular death. It's terrifying, but it happens all the time. So how do people know if they're getting mitochondrial decay?
Well, that's a good point. So mitochondrial decay is like, you don't know. You don't know. I mean, so a mitochondrial decay is going to lead down the road to some form of dysfunction. And I think we talk about mitochondrial dysfunction quite lightly, me included, because we try to talk, in layman's terms. But mitochondrial dysfunction means that that mitochondria don't work, or they're aberrant, right? I like to call it more a mitochondrial decay, right? As we age, for example, our mitochondria are not as solid as when we were younger. Or as we become sedentary, our mitochondria don't work as well. And we become more and more inflexible, metabolically inflexible. And this is one of the things that at this point I mentioned that the methodology that I developed looking at fat oxidation and lactate, it tells you, because when you have a mitochondrial decay that is not pathological, you see a decrease in the function of oxidation or burning fats and also lactate. And that's a signature, right? But again, it's not, you don't wake up one day like, oh, I think I have mitochondrial decay, right? No, you wake up one day and you go like, there's something funky. I don't know. I've been feeling strange for a while. I don't know what's going on. You go to your doctor, you get blood analysis. Your blood glucose is 150, and your A1C is 7.5 or 8. Right? Like boom, you have pre-diabetes or you have diabetes. Right? But yeah, it's and it's part of that mitochondrial decay. As I said earlier, if we were able to identify biomarkers 10, 15 years, because it's a decay, right? Then we should be able to intervene much faster and efficiently.
Yeah. So talk to me about this paper that we were talking about before. Tell me about what you just found. We're kind of rewriting it again, but tell everyone about the new discovery.
Yeah. So what we saw, we wanted to see what are the metabolic responses of sedentary health individuals, right? Versus people who are moderately active. That is, they do exercise about at least 150 minutes a week, right? Which are the recommendations, right, out there. So we wanted to see if there are differences. So what we did in this study, we looked at mitochondrial function of both groups through muscle biopsies. So we looked at muscle biopsies in the skeletal muscle, and we were looking at how those mitochondria were working. So we looked at a wide range of areas, from like how well they burned fats and carbohydrates, how well they transported carbohydrates, and how well the electron transport chain, which is the apparatus where central apparatus to mitochondria, to the furnace where you produce the ATP, works, and how well they and how much they produce ATP, right? So what we saw is that they have a significant reduction in mitochondrial function compared to active individuals, moderately active,
sedentary,
not the sedentary healthy. And this is what I call the inside out hypothesis that I'm starting to develop from that, and that originated the study. When it comes to pre-diabetes or type 2 diabetes, we clinically and at the research level, we see this or contemplate this as at a peripheral level. That is everything about glucose transport, uptake into the cell. It's about insulin signaling the cell, the receptor, hyperglycemia, hyperinsulinemia from the pancreas, right? Everything what happens at the surface. But that's the first part of the trip of glucose being burned in mitochondria, right? And there's the assumption that once the glucose enters the cell, it's going to be burned. No. That's only the first part of the trip. And the glucose, as we know, enters through the cell, through these transporters, that door that is called the GLUT force or GLUT force. And they're signaled by insulin, right? But then once glucose enters the cell, it has to be broken down to pyruvate. It's another component through 10 steps. That's the second part of the trip. The third part of the trip is that pyruvate needs to enter the furnace through another door, right? We call it the MPC. Don't worry about the name, but it's another door. And then once pyruvate enters through another door, that's the fourth part of the trip. That pyruvate has to be converted, has to enter the Krebs cycle, the famous thing that we know from biology.
Oh, the lovely Krebs cycle. Take me back to my biochemistry days. Thank you for that. Yeah.
Well, that's the fourth part of the trip. And the fifth part of the trip is that then eventually you need to produce the ATP in the electron transport chain, right? So it's a long trip. So what we were looking is at all these different parts of the trips. And what we saw is that everywhere you looked, except for the entrance, everything is dysregulated.
In the sedentary individuals.
In the sedentary.
Wow.
So you see, the first thing that is dysregulated is the entrance of pyruvate into the furnace, right? So, sorry, the entrance of glucose is normal because the number or the expression of that door at the cell surface for glucose, the GLUT force, they're the same. They have the same amount of expression. But then the door of the second part, the door of pyruvate entering mitochondria, is decreased by about 50%, significantly decreased. And then that's the door. And the entry of pyruvate into mitochondria is about 38%, something like that, decreased. And then the capacity for the electron transport chain to produce ATP is about 35 to 38% decrease. So it's a significant decrease in the production of energy, right? Just for glucose, right? And then that's where we call the inside out. These people already, they have a very strong signature of mitochondrial decay, not dysfunction. Mitochondrial decay, probably 10, 15, 20 years before, they're going to show the surface levels that glucose cannot get in, which is what we see nowadays as a diagnosis. That's on one hand regarding glucose.
Can I just ask how sedentary these individuals were that you saw it in these? Like, they just didn't do any exercise at all.
Exactly. Well, maybe they walk to the supermarket, right? But the typical person that we see in a lot of our today's societies, right? They get in the car, go to work, office, go back to the car, maybe go to the supermarket and walk. That's sedentary people. Yeah. So, but the paradox of that is that they're healthy, they don't have any clinical symptoms, but historically in biomedical research, the control has been that group, the healthy sedentary individuals, who metabolically are a disaster compared to the real control, right? And this is what, even at the university, when I needed to clear this, all the permissions to get the okay to give this data, I told them that the sedentary individuals are the intervention group, and the control are the more active individual. That at first was a no, we're not going to let you go with this study at the University of Colorado. This is a crazy idea. But actually is the reality, because, and this is what I wanted to be provocative on purpose for this, because our genes are made to be active, right? This is ingrained in our brains, in our genes being active, right? We haven't evolved to become sedentary yet, right? Our control status, except for the last 200 years or so, has been to be active always, right? And that's how our genes are. But the perception that exercise is the intervention is new to humans and is wrong, because the real intervention was to become sedentary as a result of progress. And that sedentarism is what's causing a lot of diseases, right? So I wanted to provoke with that. The real control are people who are moderately active. They have the good, well-functioning mitochondria, where people who are sedentary, they already have a decay, significant decay at the mitochondrial level, which down the road is going to take them to different diseases.
I mean, it's so interesting that you put it like that, because that's everything about our health system. We're not preventative in any way. So the fact that we're having to look at sedentary as our control group is actually a little bit frightening. I mean, it's interesting, exercise is part of who we are, the DNA, but we all pay to do exercise in gyms. I mean, I'm one of them, but it's like kind of taking us out of our normal environments. Like, obviously that's such an obvious thing, but just hearing you say it makes it even more obvious. which is just quite funny. And the fact that we're studying people who aren't moving their bodies, who aren't eating well, and calling them the controls.
Yes, you're right. And that's why it's, I don't think it's the real control, right? I think that morally active people are the control. In the same way that if we want to understand perfection, the Formula Ones are the perfect cars, and those are the elite athletes, right? I think it's a paradox that we still call sedentary people healthy when they're not. And we know down the road, now more and more epidemiological studies, we know that people who are sedentary, the vast majority end up having some diseases.
Where do you think our health status is going to go from where we are now? Like, what are you most interested in within this area of research? Because we're in an interesting time.
I think that we're already we're in deep shit as it is already, and that I think there's a good movement of definitely trying to be conscious about exercise, right? More people are exercising, probably more than in the last 100 years or 50 years at least, right? There's a conscience, there's a science to that. There's still a lot of movements, if it's HIIT or if it's zone 2 or if it's 80-20 or whatever, right? I think the important thing is to get going and to be supervised. That's important. But what I'm more concerned now, and it's about Alzheimer's. And the thing that frightens me is that I mentioned earlier, we're starting to call it type 3 diabetes or brain diabetes or end-stage type 2 diabetes. And as most of the non-communicable diseases in our society, whether it's cardiovascular disease, type 2 diabetes, cancer, it takes 20 to 25 years to develop, right? You don't wake up one day and oh, I have a heart attack. No, you've been starting to have that heart attack 20 years ago. The same thing with type 2 diabetes. And there's even the same thing with cancer. Cancer, we know, is a disease that progresses over time. And it takes 20 to 25 years for most cancers, right? That first aberrant cell that becomes then an irregular cell and then starts mutating some more genes and eventually becomes an adenoma. And then that's eventually how the evolution, cancer, it takes 20 to 25 years. But my worry is that, so our generations and our parents and previous generations, right, were diagnosed with type 2 diabetes, right, or pre-type 2 diabetes or type 2 diabetes in their 50s or 60s, right? That's, epidemiologically speaking, that was the norm. And people were diagnosed with Alzheimer's when they were in the high 70s, low 80s, something like that, right?
Yes,
So
that was my grandmother. So yeah,
exactly
that age.
Yeah. So, but we know more from epidemiological studies, the relationship between type 2 diabetes and Alzheimer's is just getting stronger and stronger. Mayo Clinic, using all this big data from medical records, right? About 80% of their Alzheimer's patients, they had problems with either diabetes or prediabetes, right? So there's a very strong correlation. And as I mentioned earlier, looking at the brain of Alzheimer's, they have insulin resistance and mitochondrial dysfunction and a big problem to utilize glucose, right? So that the thing is, like, we know if there's a correlation between Alzheimer's and type 2 diabetes. And that goes beyond a correlation because it seems to be very strong at this point and getting stronger and stronger. And there's a causality in reality, right? The problem is that we might be in big trouble because if it takes about 20 to 25 years for a person with type 2 diabetes to develop Alzheimer's, right? That's kind of when, chronologically speaking, in the 50s, 60s, people are diagnosed with prediabetes or type 2 diabetes. 70s, 80s, they develop Alzheimer's. For the first time in human history or humankind, we're seeing teenagers or younger than teenagers with pre-type 2 diabetes or type 2 diabetes, full-blown type 2 diabetes when they're 15 or 20 years old, right? If the evolution is 20 to 25 years, are we going to see a lot of people in the millions with Alzheimer's in their 40s or their 50s? If chronologically speaking, it keeps making sense. And I hope I'm utterly wrong, but and I don't think I'm the only one thinking this, although not many people are talking about it. And I think it's time to have a conversation. But if it's true, it's the end of societies as we know it. Because people in their 70s and 80s, they already have retired. There's money allocated to that. They have produced when they were 40s or 50s. But if they get Alzheimer's in their 40s or 50s, we don't have money allocated for them. They're not producing and contributing to society. It's the end of everything. So that's what the thing that worries me in the next decade or two, because this is coming to us quite soon.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's already children in America and in the UK, but more so in the States, that are being diagnosed with it from the age of 5. So,
Exactly.
I mean, it's young, and it's interesting because I listened to that. My grandmother had Alzheimer's, and she lived with it for years, and she died very late in her 80s. But she was diagnosed with it late 70s, early 80s. So she'd had a predominantly most of her life without having this condition. Think about my father, who's been diagnosed with type 2 diabetes in his 50s. And we've been, luckily, his daughter's a nutritionist, so she's got it under control and we've reversed it. But there's, now I look at that situation, and that's the thing, it is reversible, but I think the conversations that we're having in public health aren't the correct ones to help reverse it. It's just to maintain it. And then it just progressively gets worse and we go on metformin, and, that's kind of the end. But children as young as 5 now, it's completely a new whole era. And there's also, and some of this is genetic, but gestational diabetes as well is on the rise. And there's also a link, we don't know for sure, but there's also a lot of research connecting to autism. And so all of this is connected to metabolic health and mitochondrial function. But it's so interesting that there's all of these sectors, and it's now affecting from in utero to children of 5 to, up to my parents' age and beyond. Yet we still can't seem to kind of all collectively come together on this, as they're all still treated so differently. Like, how do you think we get past that? Because for me, a lot of it is about our food systems. It's the bigger picture.
The food systems, you say? Yeah. I get definitely nutrition is very important. But again, I insist, as I mentioned earlier, where do we burn food? Mitochondria. And that's the only place that we burn it. Postprandially, after a meal, under euglycemic clamp, about 80% of glucose derived from carbohydrates is burned in skeletal muscle. And during skeletal muscle is burned in mitochondria. This is why we're also talking about muscle health nowadays, right? And we tend, I was the other day I've been giving a bunch of talks lately to medical students, to medical specialists from oncology, to endocrinology, to internal medicine, pulmonology. None of them told me, when I asked the question, what is the largest organ in the body? Everybody said the skin.
You'll say
right?
skeletal muscle, won't you?
The muscle is the largest organ in the body, not only the largest, but the most active metabolically speaking. And as I mentioned, about 80% of the glucose under euglycemic clamp is oxidized in skeletal muscle within mitochondria. So it's the largest disposal for food stuff, because it's very active metabolically speaking. So this is why it comes the other paradox of the world-class athletes. For example, the cyclists in the Tour de France, right? If you look at their diet, right, it's they have somewhere between 6,000 to 9,000 calories a day for 21 days.
Yeah. Carb loading,
yeah, around 2,000, and that's because they need to exist. It's not because, I want to eat. No. If you don't have that at the Tour de France, you're dead meat, right? And they have tried it before, believe me.
And it's so hard for them, isn't it? It's like the one thing where they're forcing to get this load down them.
Yeah. And eventually they adapt because they're professionals, right? And they have an amazing stomach, intestinal tract, and they have an amazing microbiota as well, because you have to, right? But the thing is that their average intake of simple sugars is about 2,000 calories a day. So imagine someone you give to like a big bowl of sugar worth 2,000 calories a day, and you have to eat that for 21 days. Many people will die or end up in the hospital. Your only source of food, 2,000 calories, is cane sugar, right? It's crazy. Well, that's what these guys have for 21 straight days, and metabolically they're healthy as very few people in the planet, right?
Wow.
And that's metabolic flexibility. They can switch back and forth wherever they want to, right? But what I mean about, and this is an extreme case, of course, but nutrition is completely related to mitochondrial function, because that's what you burn. And this is, I think, when you have a problem, whether at the GLUT4 level or, as I described, at the inside-out model, right, which is the MPC in the mitochondria, you're not going to be able to burn glucose efficiently. You're going to make the problem worse, right? That's why nutrition works very well. That's nutrition, in my humble opinion. Does nutrition reverse mitochondrial function? I don't think so. The only way where we can improve mitochondrial function is through exercise. Can nutrition reverse the severity of the problem? Right? Of course, because you're not making it worse. And if you have a mitochondrial dysfunction, you need to decrease carbohydrates for sure, because you already have a decay, as we have shown, right? And we were talking about this study. And but yes, I think that both need to be under control: exercise and nutrition. That's what I think.
Yeah, I think it's kind of it's a chicken and egg in my brain, because I think people will go to the gym and exercise, but then we're surrounded with so many ultra processed foods and not real foods. And so it then kind of has a compounding effect, unless you're literally spending your entire day, which 90% or 95% of the population aren't exercising. They're surviving, going to work, stressed out, all of the things of hierarchy of needs. And then we just load ourselves with, what's on offer, because that is, that's the most easy, convenient foods. And so I think, it must have some impact on mitochondrial health, right? Your diet, that's from my understanding in kind of biology and as a nutritionist, that the food that you eat does impact on a cellular mechanism, the health of a cell.
Yeah, and we're in a society, I think you're right, but yeah, I think we are in society also that, these foods have a lot of conservatives, additives, colorants, and as you look at, both European Union, which is much more strict than the US AD, they regulate a lot of these conservatives or colorants that might be carcinogens, right, in large amounts.
Yes.
But you can only have per food an X amount of level per food. But you have many of these foods with the same colorant, so you have a lot of that those carcinogens entering through your body every day, and that's where we see, for example, colorectal cancer among young people. It's increasing like it's never done before. And in 15, 20 years, it's calculated to be the number one cause of mortality of cancers, of all cancers. Among the people who are young now, by the time they're older, it's going to be considered the number one cancer, because colorectal cancer numbers are off the chart. It's already very, very prevalent among these people. And why? Something is happening in maybe what they eat, those ultra processed foods, these carcinogens, meat, or who knows, plastics, etc. And that's the thing, how many things can mutate or cause mutations, right? A lot of things from what we breathe, what we eat, our stress levels, our sleep, right, can definitely have an impact on our metabolic health for sure. And that thing, not many people talk about sleep, although more and more, right? But sleep is the pillar of everything, right? I think that if you don't sleep, you can't exercise because you're too tired, and you're going to eat in survival mode, right? Because you don't have energy and you end up eating whatever. So exercise is and you're going to be more stressed. So exercise is a pillar. I mean, sleeping is a pillar. And I think we're in a society where we need to sleep way more. Don't you think?
I agree. No, I believe that is like as a nutritionist, nutrition is one of my core pillars, but sleep, I think, is the foundation. If you don't get sleep, everything in your day is a little bit harder. The food choices that you make, because your ghrelin levels, which is your hunger hormones, higher, you don't have the energy and motivation to want to go and exercise. You're a bit crueler to yourself. All of it's like compounding effects on your lifestyle decisions, which we know is the predisposing factor of health, because if we have good lifestyle decisions, then we have a better health outcome basically at the end of the day. We're more likely to go and do our exercise. So I guess on leaving this, the one thing that you would say to everyone listening to this to help improve their mitochondrial health is to get exercising 6 times a week, 5 times a week if they can, from what I'm hearing. Having a good recovery day, couple of zone 2s, resistance training 1 to 2 times of HIIT roughly through the week. That's kind of I would say, my leaving statement from this conversation to get people to connect to their mitochondrial health. Would you say that's right?
Yes, that's the only way we know that the only medicine that works for mitochondrial function is exercise, because it's the stimulus that we have since we humans were conceived. But exercise, just 4 or 5 days a week, 200, 300 minutes. And a combination of zone 2, 3 to 4 days a week, 1 or 2 days a week intensity, which you can combine within a session of zone 2, and then 2 days a week resistance training. That doesn't have to be full hour and a half. There are many routines that you can do in 30, 40 minutes, right? But I think it all puts together about 4 or 5 hours, maybe closer to 5 hours, 300 minutes. I think that we all should thrive for that. And we live in very stressful times, and but at the same time, how much time we dedicate to our Instagram or our phones or our WhatsApps or so, right? People say many times, I can't exercise, I don't have time. We do have time. At least we can get 150, 200 minutes a week. It's not easy, but we can. So I think that it's important to focus on that and have a log into this. I force myself. I'm very super busy at work, and especially in the last 2 years. So my ability to exercise has decreased significantly, but I really, really try to push myself, right? And I try to do a minimum of about 200 minutes a week, and I annotate it every week, week 1, week 2, week 3 of the year, and I need to meet that hit of 200 minutes a week. I force myself. But anyway, I think and I'm not saying I do everything right by no means, but I think that exercise is important. It's key for metabolic health and for mental health, which is a whole different area, right? I'm not an expert, but definitely mental health and exercise are so important.
I completely agree. I now take exercise as time for me. And actually, you say about the phone, it's the one time I think that we can all agree that we get away from that as well, which is why, there's many reasons why it's also good for your mental health, but that's just one reason of putting your phone in a locker and not being on your phone for 45 minutes. That feels like the ultimate self-care in my brain. And so even when I'm exhausted, knowing that I have that 45 minutes away from my phone is kind of a really compassionate act as well. So I think there's always these times, if we can, it's also carving it out for yourself, which I think when you're busy and stressed is hard, but it's essential.
It is. I agree 100%. Couldn't agree more. I'm into that.
So Inigo, I've absolutely loved having you on. Thank you for coming on. I know how busy you are. And I always have one last question, which is obviously the name of the show, Live Well, Be Well. So what does Live Well, Be Well mean to you?
For me, live well, be well is to be at first happy with yourself. It's important to have metabolic health, mental health, socialize, have friends, have family, and have interior peace, and and be able to enjoy life and be simple, I guess.
Yeah.
Which is super difficult to do, right? Takes time.
Simplicity in this world is a very hard concept to get our heads around.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Da Vinci said simplicity is the ultimate art. Simplicity is the ultimate act of sophistication.
I couldn't agree with that more. Absolutely. We need more simplicity in our life, for sure. I'm sure that's also quite good for mitochondrial health at the same time. Inigo, thank you so much. I feel like I've learned a lot about mitochondrial health and function and zone 2 and Alzheimer's 3, all of it. So thank you so much for coming on. I'll put everything in the show notes. I'd love if you could send us that paper when it's out, and we will show all of our listeners. But thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sarah. I really appreciate your time and your invitation, and just had a great time as well. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Inigo.